All right. Can you all hear me? Loud and clear? Cool. So hello, I'm Sam Parsons. Really glad to be here. Thank you for coming and listening to my talk. I'm a software engineer at Braintree, and previously I led a team at SAP Concur where we were working on GraphQL. So just a little bit about me. Let's build a one graph. So what I want to do is kind of tell you a story about how I was involved in leading a team that was contributing to a one graph at a fairly large organization. So most of you are aware, and if you came to the keynote first thing, you know what a one graph is. It's actually the first principle from the principled graph. So your company should have a unified graph instead of multiple graphs. So this isn't really very unique this principle isn't unique to Concur. Pretty common in our GraphQL space. So why, you might ask, have a one graph? There's a lot of people writing about this, but here's a couple of things that stand out to me and why they're useful. So for one thing, the schema and the resolvers are built once rather than being built repetitively throughout multiple graphs throughout an organization. So if you imagine, like, say someone has requesting currency, you don't have to build that in each of the graphs supporting each of the apps supporting it. You can build it once. And the other thing is the benefit on the client side. You can access everything you need from one location. So it seems to make sense, right? Now, there are a number of challenges in building a one graph. So I kind of think of these in two different groups. One of the groups is, if we think about like the technical side, so do we have servers that we can scale up to build a big unified graph, infrastructure around that, scaling. There's also a very big thing we talked about today. Earlier, you've heard about federation. So how do we manage to gather all of those different parts of the graph and put them together? And another nice thing that's kind of technical is a dev tooling. How do we make this nice and easy to use? But there's another side of things. For lack of a better term, let's think about it as the schema side of things. So let's think about how do we map the business model into this unified GraphQL schema. How do we design that in a unified way that can represent the entire business, not just one silo of it? How do we construct the types that they can evolve over time and represent the business as a whole? So there's a lot of tools for solving the technical challenges. Polyfederation. Some people will just have like a monolith org-wide repo, right? If you're small enough, maybe that makes sense. What we were doing at SAP Concur is we actually had something bespoke that combined multiple independent packages of types and resolvers together into one unified graph. And again, these are some tools. Depending on your use case, you may use something like those. And I think as a community, we've made some really great progress on the technical challenges. But I think that's only half the problem. The other part of the problem is still out there. So just to kind of paint the background a little bit for you. So situation here, SAP Concur, we have an organization-wide GraphQL platform that's being built. We have a vision of migrating all of the existing GraphQL. Already we had some different GraphQL services. We want to migrate them all into one unified graph. And that meant if we wanted to migrate those existing ones in there, we actually can't begin from scratch. We're actually going to have some legacy GraphQL. So that's a constraint that we had. We also had lots of teams and contributors. So that means that you have to find some way to get to the same consensus about how you're going to build that. For us, we were not building a public graph. We were building a private graph for our own internal or for our own public web and mobile clients. So the addition of the mobile clients means that we have to have care around the non-additive changes to that graph. So for example, we don't want to break existing mobile apps when we change something to the graph. So additive changes are fine. Non-additive ones can cause problems. So what I'm going to try and do now is kind of just talk through some of the story about like what we actually did. So early on, when I was tasked with starting to contribute to this graph, my team, I realized that the most important thing is actually going to be the people. and the connections with the people is the only way that we can possibly succeed. We can't just solve this with a technical problem. It's a people problem or a people solution that we need. So we have to build relationships. We have to build a community. And it may seem obvious, but I think it's really important to realize that if you want to build a big unified graph for your organization, it actually matters the people and the approach to building community. So actually one of the things I wanted to mention quickly is, like many big companies, our domain is too big really for one person to understand. It's too big for even one team to understand completely. The domain, the business model, takes understanding from a wide set of people. So you need that community for that. And you also have to think about the side effects to other people as you contribute to the graph. And you have to think about looking into the future, how can we build this in such a way that this is going to evolve well? And that takes insight beyond your team. So that's really some of the ways why it's important to take this approach. So some of the steps that we took in building a community is gathering the community, finding the other people at your organization that are going to be contributing to this graph, and connect with them, build the relationships that you need in order to start that community. So this happened really pretty fluidly for us at SAP Concur. We, the early adopters of this unified graph, started to just meet. We got to know each other, video conversations, and then we started meeting regularly. And when you meet regularly, these are some things that I think really help us succeed. So we always would allow anyone to contribute to the agenda. We'd invite anybody to come. We were meeting across not only time zones, but multiple nations. So we had people from Europe, people from the US. So we wanted to make this really easy for anybody, anywhere within Concur, to join. And we tried to keep notes of what was decided, what was talked about, and share those with the wider community. In addition to that, you also want to create a space where that can take place. So these are some of the things that we did, is use Slack. You could use something like that to have that up-to-date sort of communication that you may want to do. But also, you want to keep track of things that they last longer, right? So Slack is not a great way to keep track of documentation. So we also created a repository that we could use for keeping the documentation from the community. So this was, in general, sort of our approach to community. One of the things I haven't talked about yet is this idea of breakout meetings for specific areas of the graph. So in our area, we had multiple products. And those products would go across both web and mobile. And so we gathered developers for individual product areas together across web and mobile, across multiple teams. And we were able then to focus really quite detailed on actually designing areas of that graph and discussing the challenges that were coming up. And another thing we did was take workshops. So we would take our team aside, anybody could join, and we would work on building consensus around different topics, whether they were schema design topics or solving different problems that had come up in building our graph together. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of creating a shared vision. And it's really almost as important as the approach to that people are the core of this, is also understanding that we have to go in the same direction. So we can drive towards that same goal only when we can understand and describe that goal in the same way. So for us, a couple of the things that was really important was to try to remove the business logic that we had put inside of, that had ended up really inside of web clients or ended up inside of mobile clients. And one of our goals, why we were trying to do this, was to push that down a layer, get that so that that's consistent across all of our clients. And another thing we wanted to do was to find a way that we could increase efficiency. So how can we share this business logic between multiple places? How can we share them between web and mobile together? So that was kind of our high-level vision, and that vision was cast to the community as a whole. But I think there's a further question that also relates to vision, and can we create a shared vision of how we're going to do this? So for us, that led to the evolution of work on some schema design guidelines, to workshops on trying to get to the same place as far as how are we going to approach building this, and working agreements between different teams. So in our work so far on schema design guidelines, these are some things that I've found are really helpful. So you know you're on the right path if these things are in place. So you're following the best practices of the wider GraphQL community. So you don't want to be going down a different direction than there's some group wisdom that we're gathering together in GraphQL. You want to stay in tune with that and reflect that in your guidelines. Also, though, you want to be detailed enough to answer the questions of your contributors. And they may come from non-GraphQL backgrounds. And that may be a challenge there. So you want to make sure that you're giving enough detail, enough information that you can answer those questions. And high level is this goal of trying to create a schema that is evolvable over time. Because the goal here is to get all of the clients onto this one unified graph. We're going to need a way to evolve and to change over time. So that's another principle, I think, for success. So I'll just kind of mention a couple of high-level guidelines and things that we came to. I'm not going to get super in-depth because I think there's a lot of written documentation about this that I think could be useful for you. But one of the high ones is preferring object types over simpler, primitive, built-in GraphQL types. And that allows, if you're using it for both input and response types, it allows you to extend over time. And so it's one of these principles of making it evolvable is to, when you're kind of choosing early on to respond with a string, maybe it'd be better to respond with an object that includes a string. And then if someone else also needs to extend that in the future, they can do that. And then there's another counterintuitive principle, and that's sometimes it's better to create higher quantity of specific mutations or queries rather than one or several multi-purpose ones. And by breaking that apart, you can make it easier to evolve things. You can add new things without breaking existing use cases. And I think congruent with that is also to not be afraid to name things really specifically in your types. That's okay. In fact, it's encouraged. The more specific you are, that's better. And if you're using a generic name for something that actually is fairly specific, you're kind of like land grabbing and sitting on something that's actually prime real estate for something else. And there's a limited, finite set of possible names for types within your unified graph. And so thinking about that early on is important, I think. And as a high-level principle, coming to your schema definition from the business domain, not just reflecting it out of your data APIs, not just reflecting it blindly too much from your UIs. I think you should begin with that design phase of the schema, joining both the back end and the front end together, create that schema, and then you have a contract you can both build out from there. And funnily enough, delaying defining things like interfaces until you understand the domain fully. Sometimes the best thing to do is to delay, and I think this goes along with the idea of demand-driven GraphQL development. Sometimes it's better just to push back and say, let's not implement something yet until we understand it fully, or let's implement something specific like a type, rather than the interface yet until we can abstract away from multiple situations that inform that decision. So there's a lot of resources out there, just linked to them here, and you'll be able to get my slides from that link below if you're interested in some more details on that. And the third thing I want to talk about is managing change appropriately. Excuse me. Now, some of this is present within the idea of having guidelines in place, that shared vision, but there's also at the heart of this a process for how we manage change. So this is a another common phrase at Concur, hope is not a plan. And we don't just want to hope that our schema will evolve and that we can manage change in the long term. We need to have a plan in place. We need to think about that early on, how we're going to do that. So I think when you think about controlling how change occurs within your graph, there's a continuum. And on one side of the continuum is something freeform, where you just allow everyone to just kind of contribute very easily, very quickly. And early on in a project, when you have few participants, whether they're consumers or contributors to your graph, that could make sense. When you're trying out things, proof of concept, that's great. But as you go further along, and so you want to include more participants or more contributors, you find that you want to have a bit more control around how that schema is generated. And you want to have more review processes in place as far as the schema has changed. Is this a good change to the schema? Is this going to cause other problems in other parts of the graph? But the challenge, and this is why it's a trade-off, is that as soon as you do that, you reduce the velocity, and sometimes very quickly and extremely. So our approach to this was to kind of hit somewhere in the middle along that graph. So we didn't want it completely chaotic. We knew that we had to get a lot of things in, so we didn't want to slow down the velocity incredibly, but we wanted to have at least some process around that. So for us, it kind of evolved organically, really, but we had a lot of informal communication in our Slack channels and in the breakout groups for different areas of the graph. And that's where a lot of the conversation would go around. Here's some upcoming changes that we're planning to make to the graph. Is this going to cause problems? How can we design this in a way that makes sense long term? And so we had a lot of review, but there wasn't a arbiter who decided yes or no for every change. We trusted people to contribute changes and to reach out if they needed input and advice from the rest of the community. So some of the things kind of going forward for ideas that we could put in place. So getting analytics on the use of your graph is really helpful if you want to know whether you can deprecate fields, whether you can remove them. And there's a lot of tools out there for that. But no matter what you're using, I think you need to find ways to get at the heart of that data. How is your graph being used? And there's a potential also to use CI tools to post on your PRs or changes, how this schema change, or this particular PR, how it's going to impact the overall schema. Is it going to break things? And integration with CI and GitHub PRs is really helpful. And I think another thing that's really useful is to understand we actually need to approach deprecation early. It's not something you can push down the road. You need to start thinking early on, how do we deprecate things out of this? Because we're going to have to do that. And if you have mobile clients, no one really wants to do that, right? It's going to break some clients. So I think approaching it where you need to have that policy, you need to start having the conversations. How are we going to do this? When are we going to do it? Is really helpful. GitHub, for example, has, you can look at how they communicate their breaking changes as a public API. So they have even more concerns, right? It's not just their own internal clients. They also have a public API that many people can use. So how do they communicate those changes? So GitHub is a great example of that. So just kind of in summary here, it's kind of the three principles I think of when solving the schema side of that is building that community and establishing the shared vision and managing the change appropriate for where you're at as an organization. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to be hosting a table talk tomorrow lunchtime, and I'd really like to make that a place where people can share their experiences and the things that they're trying to do in this space, because I think there's a lot of space for collaboration across our wider GraphQL community about these topics. So any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so you had mentioned you had some legacy GraphQL endpoints that probably couldn't be changed too much when you're designing one graph. Were you able to integrate them into one graph without too much change to the code base, or were you able to do it without it?
A lot of them were migrated into the one graph without changes at all in order to support mobile clients who were using them. So I think that caused challenges in that we may not want to keep those designs long term. So that causes the questions of how do we change existing unideal types? Yep.
How did you manage the actual artifacts of the graph itself? Did you have a mono repo or where the PR is going and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So your question is, how do we manage the artifacts? So things like the types and resolvers and so forth, right?
Really, the SDL.
The schema, yep.
Schema itself.
So for us, we had a set of different packages, NPM packages, that are combined together to build a unified graph as part of a CI process. So anytime any particular person updates or contributes a package, then that will change the graph as a whole. So it kind of exists separately, not in one place at one time.
Yeah, so there's no one place where somebody can see the whole graph other than by going to your server.
Yeah, exactly.
Any more questions?
All right. Thank you very much.
Big round of applause for Sam. Thank you very much, Sam.